Welcome back, everybody. We are going to start our first lab with muscles. I want to start by saying that the next 3 labs are the most challenging labs of this course. There is a ton of information. There are very detailed locations that your muscles will connect. There are a lot of actions that our muscles will do. And we also have to be thinking about muscles that perform the same actions, called synergists, and muscles that are performing the opposite actions, called antagonists. So there is a lot to really put together in these. We will be looking at really detailed models in your labs. You really need to find time to spend in labs and in open labs to do really well in this. So please take this warning or these words of wisdom, whatever you want to call it, and really find some time over the next 3 weeks to focus in on these muscles. It is really challenging. Now, that being said, these insertions and origins that we're going to be going over, you've learned about these in the bone labs. So these terms should not be that foreign to you. Plus, you've learned about a bunch of different actions in your articulations labs. So a good idea would be to go over and review the appendicular skeleton, your axial skeleton, your articulations labs and notes to perform a little bit better in here. I also want to mention that for these muscle labs, the lectures that I'm going through are not going to be that exciting. We're going to kind of run through these muscles. We're going to talk about where they are, where they're inserting, where their origin is, and that's essentially it. We're going to kind of go quickly through this because your learning is really going to come from your hands-on experiences with the models. So use these recorded lectures as a reference tool when you're at home, and also use your lab manuals. There's a lot of really great information in your lab manuals. And then there's a ton of great information and resources online. GetBodySmart.com is great. KenHub is great. So there's a ton of resources online. So please also utilize that to help with that three-dimensionality of the muscles and their movements. So if we start talking a little bit about skeletal muscles, well, there are over 600 skeletal muscles in our bodies. Most of them occur in pairs, meaning a left and a right side, and skeletal muscle is voluntary. We decide when we want to contract it. What does it do for us? Well, it helps with movement, it helps with communication, our posture, as well as our heat generation. Now, muscle tissue are elongated cells that are responding to stimuli, usually from a neuron, by contracting, so getting shorter. They're exerting some kind of force on another tissue. When we want to move, that muscle is contracting. The forces are being transferred from the muscle cells to our tendon and then onto the bone, and we are then able to move through time and space. And there's 3 types. Skeletal, which we'll look at today, cardiac, which you'll look at in 202, and then we'll briefly touch on smooth muscle in 201, and you'll see it again in 202. So here's some histology of what our skeletal muscle tissue looks like. We have these long cylindrical unbranched cells, and they have striations, and these striations are these lines that run perpendicular to the direction of our muscle cell. These cells have multiple nuclei, and those nuclei get pushed towards the sides and out towards the plasma membrane like we saw with adipose tissue. This makes more room for proteins in the middle of those cells. We're going to learn all kinds of different skeletal muscles. You can see a couple of examples here, biceps brachii or quadriceps. These ones are probably pretty familiar to you. And they are responsible for voluntary contractions. you may hear the term fibers or muscle fibers. That's the same as saying a muscle cell. When you're in your labs, you may see two views, transverse view and a longitudinal view. You're going to be wanting to see the longitudinal view. That's going to give you the best view of those striations and to kind of see those multiple nuclei and those long cylindrical cells. In the transverse section, you really get to see how those multiple nuclei are pushed out towards the periphery of those cells. This is our smooth muscle. We have these short fusiform cells. They're non-striated and they only have one central nucleus here. Smooth muscle is involuntary, so we are not controlling that. We find it in our digestive tract, in our arteries, the uterus, pupil, and this is responsible for sustained contractions. It helps move food through our digestive tract. We call this peristalsis. It also helps during birth. This is what's pushing the baby out. If we look at the bottom right, you can see that on either end of the muscle we have a tendon that's going to attach it to a bone or some fascia. And then in between the tendons we have the belly of the muscle. These are our contractile cells that are making up that belly. Now, an origin is essentially the attachment point of a muscle that is not moving during a contraction. And the insertion is the attachment point of a muscle that is moving during contraction. What you'll find out is that depending on the type of movement that you're doing, that origin and insertion can switch or flip-flop. That's something that you'll learn as you move on into your exercise science or physical therapy coursework. But for our purposes, our definition is going to be it's the attachment point of muscle that does not move during contraction and the attachment point of muscle that moves during contraction. So make sure you get those down. All of the muscles that you learn moving forward require that you know one action for each muscle, one synergist of each muscle, and one antagonist of each muscle. If you learn that one muscle is flexing the forearm and you know another muscle flexes a forearm, great, you've got a synergist. If you're learning one muscle flexes the forearm, you're going to want to think of a muscle that's extending the forearm, and that can give you your antagonist. It is not as complicated as you might think, but getting all the actions down does take some time, and so that's why you're going to want to study these in groups and compartments as you move through these labs. The other thing you'll notice as we go through each of these slides is that muscles that have an asterisk require that you can name one origin and one insertion of those muscles. A couple of other terms that we're going to need to know when you're thinking about moving your muscles or moving a joint, we have a prime mover. And a prime mover is the muscle that is producing most of that force of that movement. Synergists then aid that prime mover, and so they're adding stability to the joint, or they're sort of tweaking and modifying the movement that's happening. And then antagonists are opposing the prime mover. They are preventing an excessive movement, so they're trying to keep you from hyperextending a joint. And muscles contract, they don't push. So if you flex a body part, you need to have an antagonistic muscle to contract on the opposite side of that compartment to return that body part back to its anatomical position. And then we also have fixators, and fixators are muscles that are preventing the movement of a bone that your prime mover is attached to. So let's look at an example here when we talk about the flexion of our forearm. Here is our prime mover. We have the biceps brachii. This is going to contract and basically pull on our bone, and this is going to draw our forearm up. And so we're going to go from 180 degrees in our anatomical position, and we're going to flex that forearm, and we're going to now be at a 45-degree angle. So that's our main muscle, or our prime mover. The brachialis is our synergist. It is also causing forearm flexion, but not as much force, and it's fine-tuning that movement. Our antagonistic muscles then are on the opposite side of our humerus here. These are our triceps brachii. They are going to extend, so we can see that they are going to pull on our ulna, and they're going to extend that forearm and return it back to anatomical position. And then we have our fixator, and our fixator would be our rhomboids, and you don't see those in our picture here, but our rhomboid major and minor would be holding that scapula in place. So as we load these joints, and as we are, say, picking up a big rock, our biceps brachii is contracting, we're flexing our forearms, we don't want the scapula to move down or to fall towards that load. So we have these fixator muscles to hold those bones in place so that these other muscles can work appropriately. Now we also have intrinsic and extrinsic muscles, and this is helpful to learn about when you're thinking about the way these muscles are contracting. So intrinsic muscles are located within a specific region, and they act on that specific region. So we can see we have some muscles that are located within the hand that are acting on the hand. Extrinsic muscles then have the bellies of the muscles in a compartment, so here in the forearm, but their actions actually occur in the hand. Now, just a quick review, these are some terms that you're really gonna need to know moving forward. You're gonna use origin, insertion, action, synergist, and antagonist a lot as you move forward. Less so with fixator and prime mover. A couple of other terms that you'll see as we move through these next few lectures, the first being aponeurosis. This is a really broad, flat tendon that sometimes has a bony attachment, sometimes does not. We have one up on top of our skull, and our palm, and our rectus abdominis. A retinaculum is anchoring a tendon, and fascia surrounds our muscles. This is sort of like the saran wrap around our muscles that helps compartmentalize our muscles. And then last, when you learn these muscles, be thinking about these prefixes. So digiti, this means of a digit, so it's going to act on a digit. So flexor digitorum is going to flex your digits. A levator is going to elevate a body part. Profundus means that that muscle body is deep, whereas superficialis means that that muscle body is more superficial. And then quadriceps or triceps or biceps tells us how many heads of the muscle we have. So the quadriceps muscle, we have 4 heads there. With the biceps, we only have 2. When we talk about a thigh, we're talking about hip to knee. When we talk about a leg, we're talking knee to ankle. So a lot of times, just in general conversation, we say our leg and we think the entire thing. Well, that's true, but in anatomy, we have very specific regions. So here's our thigh and here's our leg. So if we say we're flexing the thigh, we're talking about this region here. If we say we flex the leg, we're talking about this region here. So pause the video here, digest all this information we just went over, and then we'll jump into all the different muscles you're going to be required to know for this lab. Alrighty, welcome back. Let's get into it. Now remember, as I mentioned on the very first slide, we're going to kind of run through these muscles. We're going to point out some features, and then we're going to move on. The bulk of your learning should be hands-on, active learning in lab and in open labs. That is going to benefit you the most. The other thing that's going to be really helpful is when you're in labs, we have flagging, strips of flagging at your tables. I would get one of the whole skeletons, pull it over by where you're sitting, get some of that flagging, and as you're studying the muscles that require origins and insertions, put the origin to the feature on the bone, put the insertion to the feature of the bone, and look at where that muscle would be on your body, and think about the action that would occur if that muscle were to get shorter. How many joints is it crossing? If it's crossing 2 joints, it's going to act on both of those joints. So be thinking about what could happen at those joints based off of the location of that origin and insertion. So the first muscle we're going to look at is called the iliopsoas. And notice there's an asterisk here. And so in our slide here, we have an origin and we have an insertion. Now the iliopsoas is actually 2 muscles that that combine together. We have our psoas major right here, and you can see this over on the right, highlighted in green. And we have our iliacus muscle here on the left in green. Together we have the iliopsoas. Now when we say the origin, T12 through L5, you can see that our psoas major has T12 down through L5, but we see our iliac crest, iliac fossa here, and that's our iliacus muscle. So we have these 2 origins. They both insert at the lesser trochanter of the femur. So what is it going to do? Well, it's flexing our thigh, and it can also flex our lumbar vertebrae. Our sartorius is the longest muscle in the body. We don't have an asterisk, so you don't need to know its origin and insertion. You do need to be able to identify it on a muscle model, but this is going to flex and laterally rotate the thigh and flex the leg. The gracilis here in green, this is a thigh adductor, so we're going to add this leg back to the midline. And it's also crossing here at our knee joint, so it's going to help with leg flexion. Pectineus is an adductor and a flexor of the thigh. This is a small muscle. It's a little bit hard to see on your models in lab. So we do have muscle guides that will be out on the lab tables, and they will, as you read through those, it's a step-by-step identification for each of those models. Adductor brevis here is adducting, flexing, and laterally rotating the thigh. Our adductor longus, note we've got an asterisk here, so our origin is our pubis, right up here, and our insertion is the linea aspera on that femur. So again, it's going to adduct, it's going to flex, and it's going to laterally rotate our thigh. Adductor magnus, we need to know its origin and insertion. Here the origin is the pubis and the ischium. Our insertion is the linea aspera, gluteal tuberosity, and adductor tubercle of the distal femur. Now if you look here, this is pretty cool. What I think it's pretty cool is we have a origin up along the pubis and the ischium. But look at the muscle fibers. They are spreading all the way down throughout this entire femur. What that means is we have lots of muscle fibers coming off of a small origin, spreading out through a very large insertion. And so that allows this muscle to have a lot of force during contraction. Now, if we're going a little bit more superficial, we have our quadriceps. So rectus femoris is asterisk, okay? Quadriceps muscles are a group of 4 muscles. We want you to know an origin and insertion for rectus femoris. Our AIIS and the margin of our acetabulum is our origin. Our insertion is going to come down to that tibial tuberosity by that patellar tendon. It's crossing our acetabulofemoral joint. It's crossing our knee joint, so it can help with thigh flexion and extending the leg. So when you bring your leg up to kick yourself in the butt, then your rectus femoris is going to return your leg back down below you. The other three muscles all start with vastus. So our vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and vastus intermedius, they are all leg extensors as well. So they're synergists to each other, but also our rectus femoris. And you can see down here in green where each of these are. So vastus medialis and vastus lateralis, and then with our vastus intermedius, we actually have to remove the rectus femoris to see where that vastus intermedius is. Tensor fasciae lata is lateral on our legs. It is flexing, abducting, medially rotating our thighs. Posteriorly, here, this big muscle in green is our gluteus maximus. So we're going to know the origin is the outer iliac blade, iliac crest, sacrum, and coccyx, and then it inserts to the gluteal tuberosity and that IT band of tensor fasciae lata. Here we're extending and laterally rotating our thigh. It also helps to brace and support our knee. If we go deep to the gluteus maximus, we can see our gluteus medius here. This is abducting and medially rotating the thigh. And our gluteus minimus, deep to the medius, also abducts and medially rotates our thigh. Our hamstrings, or biceps femoris, we have a long and a short head. The origin of this muscle is the ischial tuberosity and the linea aspera, and it's inserting to the head of the fibula and the lateral condyle of the tibia. We're spanning two joints here, the knee and the hip joint, and so we can extend the thigh and we can flex the legs. Our semitendinosus and semimembranosus, these are also part of our hamstrings. They are extending the thigh and flexing the leg. So go ahead and digest some of this material, practice a little bit, and then we'll move on to muscles of the leg. All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. We are going to get a little bit smaller with our muscles, and we're going to be looking at the muscles of the leg and the ankle. We'll start with gastrocnemius. Our gastrocnemius, these are our calf muscles. So they originate at the condyles of the femur, and they insert on the calcaneus via that calcaneal tendon. So we're going to flex our leg, and we're going to plantar flex our foot. Deep to that is our soleus. Our soleus has an origin on the posterior proximal tibia and the fibula, then it's going to insert on that calcaneus via that calcaneal tendon. It is going to plantar flex that foot. Plantaris is a leg flexor and a plantar flexor. Popliteus helps to stabilize the knee joint. It also helps flex the leg. Tibialis posterior has an origin on the proximal portion of the tibia and the fibula, and it inserts on our metatarsals. We're going to plantar flex, so it's actually coming onto the bottom, the plantar surface of that foot, so it can pull down, but it can also invert that foot. So remember, inversion is also the same as supination of the foot. Flexor digitorum longus flexes our toes. It also assists with plantar flexion and inversion of that foot. Flexor hallucis longus. If you remember, our hallux is our big toe, our pollex is our thumb, and so the flexor hallucis longus is going to flex that hallux and also plays a role in foot inversion. Tibialis anterior then is a muscle on the anterior side of our tibia, and it has an origin of the lateral condyle and the proximal tibia. If we follow that down, we see that it inserts on our first metatarsal and our medial cuneiform, and this is going to help dorsiflex, so lifting our foot when we're taking a step forward, and also pulling up so that we can invert that foot. Extensor digitorum longus, an antagonist to flexor digitorum longus. We have an origin of the lateral condyle of the tibia. We can see it right down here in green, and so it's kind of covered up by tibialis anterior and fibularis longus. And then it inserts 2nd through 5th middle and distal phalange. It's going to extend those toes or extend those digits, but it also helps with dorsiflexion. Extensor hallucis longus is going to extend our hallux as well as dorsiflex our foot. Fibularis longus, we are looking here at the head and the shaft of the fibula and the lateral condyle of the tibia. It's going to insert on our 5th metatarsal in our medial cuneiform. It's going to come down underneath, and it's going to help plantar flex and evert the foot. And if you remember, we talked about the term a retinaculum. This is kind of like a rubber band that goes around these tendons and holds them close to the bone to use that as a fulcrum. Fibularis brevis is a little bit deep to our fibularis longus, and it's again going to plantar flex and evert the foot. And then fibularis tertius, which you can just see right down here, and it's not actually in green. Fibularis brevis is still in green. You can see fibularis tertius here actually dorsiflexes and everts the foot, so slightly different. Thanks again for joining in. I know it's a lot. Good luck studying this week. Good luck on your exams, and we'll pick up with our next muscle lab next week.